Okay, so I'm talking now about the control of gastric acid secretion. I want to try and get through it all in one video, so I'm going to try and go through it as quick as I can, and hopefully I don't miss too much. Alright, I like to think of it in 3 stages, and that's how most of the textbooks do it as well. So I'll present it that way. How I'm going to do it is talking about what happens when you actually eat. So let's start off. The scenario I'm going to use is when you go to a place like McDonald's, for example. So you're at Macca's, you're ordering your food, and you're looking at all the burgers, and you got the sound, so you got sight, sound, and thought. So that's what happens to you there. So all that's activated, all your cerebral cortex. There we go. And because before you eat, in the past many times you've had the sight, sounds, and thoughts happening at the same time, you're actually going to get a conditioned response. And that stimulates your hypothalamus and your medulla oblongata. And what that does, so that's here, around here, and that stimulates your vagus nerve. With its nerve endings in your body and the acrum. So vagus nerve, and that stimulates it to secrete acetylcholine at the nerve endings. And I'm going to draw that as a little triangle. It does a few things, and I'm going to talk about exactly what that does a little bit later. Alright, so that's the very first part of phase 1. Phase 1 as a whole lasts minutes. Another thing that happens in phase 1 is when you're actually the process of actually eating and smelling the food. So you got your food here, you're smelling it, and you're actually eating it. So you got your smell plus taste receptors. What they do when they're stimulated, they stimulate the medulla oblongata. I'll just say the medulla, and then that in turn stimulates your vagus nerve, and stimulates for the nerve endings to secrete more acetylcholine. Alright, so that's it really for phase 1, for the sort of inputs. Now for phase 2. Phase 2 is the gastric phase. And it's probably the most biggest phase. It lasts 3 to 4 hours and has a large input. 3 to 4 hours. Alright. So what happens here? It's in 2 parts, similar to phase 1. Part 1 is we actually look at, you think about what's happening. This food here has travelled down your esophagus. The bolus is now in your stomach, and it causes stomach stretching. So part 1 is physical stretching. This does 2 things, both neuro. 1, it causes the vasovagal reflex. And that goes and stimulates your medulla, which in turn stimulates your vagus and the nerve endings secrete acetylcholine into the interstitial. So I'll just draw them in there, because that's where it's going to be. So it stimulates that. That's one thing it does. And the other thing it does is local reflex. And it still has nerve endings secrete acetylcholine, but they don't have to synapse and go to your central nervous system or anything like that. So it's all local, but that still has the same effect to secrete acetylcholine. So that's the 2 parts there of one part of gastric phase. The other part is actually to do more with chemistry. So we got chemical receptors, and what happens here is this food, so you got all the meat and protein in there, is that acts as a hydrogen buffer, H plus buffer, and that causes a increase in the pH. So your stomach contents have gone more alkalotic, and what this does is it actually it stimulates the G cells. It stimulates G cells, and it also inhibits. And it also inhibits the D cells. So these G cells, which I'll draw up here, G cells, they secrete histamine. I mean, not histamine, sorry. These G cells secrete gastrin, which I'll just draw as a little circle. So that's in the interstitial. And these D cells, low pH these D cells that high pH inhibits, they would normally secrete somatostatin. So I'll just write therefore less somatostatin. I'll talk about that in more detail a bit later. So far we've talked about the inputs for sort of what's going on in your head and what's going on in your stomach. The other phase, which is called the intestinal or enteric phase, or intestinal, probably isn't as important for secretion, but I'll talk about it anyways. Just to go back very quickly, when I'm talking about pHs here, a pH higher than say 2, pH greater than 2 will stimulate these G cells. Alright, so onto intestinal. If you've thought about our food before in your stomach, at the very start of gastric emptying, when it's in your upper lower intestine, so in your duodenum, so it's around there, and it's low pH, so this chyme that's in there, low pH, partially digested proteins, just write proteins. What this does is it actually stimulates the intestinal mucosa cells. And this gets a little bit, I find this a little bit complicated, but they actually secrete something called intestinal they actually secrete something called intestinal gastrin, or some places call it enteric gastrin. And we're going to draw that as a circle there as well, because it basically does the exact same thing as gastrin does, so I'll just draw it in there. So you can just think of it as being gastrin, really. We've talked about acetylcholine and gastrin. Now you might know that there's also another very important thing. Histamine. Histamine is produced by enterochromaffin-like cells, which I'm going to call ECL cells. Enterochromaffin-like cells, and they secrete histamine. Now histamine, which I'll just draw as a back, and I'll talk about each of these in their own things. Now acetylcholine, there is actually receptors in the parietal cells for it. I'll just draw them there. So it actually has a direct effect on increasing your H+, but it actually has its biggest effect on increasing the activity of G cells and also ECL cells. So it does have a direct effect, but it actually really has its real effect by stimulating the G cells and the ECL cells. And the G cells itself is, and gastrin's often talked about as a really important one, and it is, but there is a receptor for it in the parietal cell, just like acetylcholine, and that does have an effect. But what makes it really important is that it also stimulates histamine. And combined with all these stimulating the parietal cells leads to a huge influx of hydrochloric acid into the stomach. So they're all important. The neuro pathway probably accounts for about 40%, and the gastrin. Okay, so that's the real basics of stimulation of HCl, of gastric acid.